an essay by Lauren MacIver Thompson demonstrates how Justice Samuel Alito cherry-picked historical evidence to justify the Supreme Court's June 2022 decision in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, which, as you all know, overturned the 1973 decision in Roe v. Wade, when a very different Supreme Court held that abortion was a right protected by the U.S. Constitution. Thompson argues that the majority opinion deliberately ignores decades of careful scholarship on the multifaceted origins of abortion law in order to reach a rather tortured conclusion, in essence, that because there has never been an explicit constitutional right to terminate a pregnancy in the past, therefore, there should not be one now. So American women are experiencing the fallout from Dobbs v. Jackson as individual states enact laws that, on the one hand, criminalize or recriminalize abortion, or on the other, uphold a woman's right to manage her own reproductive health. In this legal arena, Thompson asserts that historians must continue to expose the hypocrisy of ahistorical arguments that lawyers, judges, and lawmakers are invoking to criminalize abortion. We are thus pleased to welcome two historians who are doing just that. Patricia Cline Cohen is Professor of History Emerita at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and incidentally, she was one of my mentors when I was a graduate student there, and a role model as well. She co-authored a friend of the court brief that was filed for the defendants in the Dobbs case, and she has recently co-authored a second friend of the court brief for Planned Parenthood of Michigan v. Michigan House of Representatives and Senate. Her current work, obviously, is on the history of abortion, but her research and teaching interests span U.S. women's history, the history of sexuality, the history of journalism, and 19th century health and sex reformers. Her book publications include A Calculating People, The Spread of Numeracy in Early America in 1985, The Murder of Helen Jewett, The Life and Death of a Prostitute in 19th Century New York, 1998, which is a great true crime mystery, I will say. And the Flash Press, as a co-author, the Flash Press Sporting Male Weeklies in 1840s New York, 2008. She also served as chair of the UCSB History Department and the Women's Studies program, and as interim dean of humanities. The title of her talk tonight is up there, Abortion, Law and Practice in the 19th Century. She is joined tonight by Lina-Maria Murillo, assistant professor of history, gender, women, and sexuality studies, and Latinx studies at the University of Iowa. She also is co-director with Professor Natalie Fixmer-Oray of the Maternal Health and Reproductive Politics Obermann Collaborative at the university. And I will say that when Linda and Patty and I began to think about a program that would provide a historical perspective on abortion, at that very time, I happened to catch an NPR interview with Lina on the history of abortion laws in Iowa, and I'm going, how perfect is this timing? I'm going, because I knew we had found the perfect second speaker to be a complement what Pat had already agreed to do. Lina is completing her first book, Fighting for Control, Power, Reproductive Care, and Race in the U.S.-Mexico Borderlands, an article, Birth Control, Border Control, The Movement for Contraception in El Paso, Texas, 1936 to 1940, appeared in the Pacific Historical Review in 2021. Espanta Cigüeñas, Race and Abortion in the U.S.-Mexico Borderlands is forthcoming in another journal, Signs, a Journal of Women in Culture and Society. Her talk tonight is titled The Case for Liberalizing Abortion Law in Iowa in the Years Before Roe v. Wade. So before I turn the podium over to Pat, who will speak first, I want to note that she and Lina will take questions from the audience after both of them have spoken this evening. So with that, would you please welcome Patricia Cline Cohen and Lina-Maria Murillo.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Rebecca, and I want to thank the League of Women Voters of this city for inviting me here. Little feedback. That's from the mic, huh? I'll just step away a bit here. I'm happy to do it for many reasons, and not the least among them is that I grew up in a family where my mother was very active in the League of Women Voters in the 1940s in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And then we moved to Palo Alto, California, and she remained active there. And about 5 years ago, when we had a memorial service for her, numbers of people who remembered her from the League had read her obituary and showed up. So it feels like been a part of her life, certainly, and by extension, a part of mine, too. So let's see if I can make sure I know how to do this. Roe and Dobbs, two really important Supreme Court decisions, 50 years apart. Roe based its reasoning on Anglo-American common law, or at least it said in its reasoning about abortion, that it pointed out that under the early British or Anglo-American law called the common law in the colonies and well into the 19th century, the law about abortion as developed in precedents in cases in English courts and precedences and then passed down, kept alive by treatise writers who would talk about what the law was, defined abortion as a crime only after quickening. When a woman feels the infant stir in her body, that's when abortion became illegal, and nothing was said about before that moment. Women, Blackmun wrote in writing that decision, in the early pregnancy had the opportunity to make this choice. The opportunity to make this choice. He wasn't basing the whole decision on that by any means, but he was acknowledging that there was some fortuitous history or tradition in American life that had preceded the Roe decision. So that we weren't really departing from something or from moving into territory that had never been there before. We were echoing some state that existed in the past. Dobbs, utterly different on this. Abortion, always impermissible and disapproved. A right to abortion is not deeply rooted in the nation's history and traditions, Alito wrote in his controlling decision. Okay. History and traditions were not just loose language. It's a very specific legal meaning, and I want to spend a few minutes before I get into the actual history of abortion just nailing this down for you. The 14th Amendment has a wonderful first clause promising rights to citizens and then also to all persons. And the phrase in that first section that's relevant to us is in saying that all persons, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. This was a valuable thing to have in the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment was one of 3 amendments passed after the Civil War to ensure rights to emancipated blacks after the war, but later Supreme Court decisions looked at this language and decided that liberty here was something that was guaranteed not only by the federal Constitution, but by this amendment that extended it to all of the states. And so we got some really powerful and interesting court decisions starting in 1965 with the Connecticut case in Griswold, Connecticut, that prohibited states from preventing married couples from accessing abortion. Right? There's a set of laws here that entered our legal system through this door of the 14th Amendment. More talk was engaged in about the right to privacy, but of course the right to privacy is not in the Constitution either. And the justices grounded it in this notion of a right that people had under the 14th Amendment. Also to review, the first 8 amendments, the first 8 articles of the Bill of Rights talk about very specific rights that people have. But the 9th says, if we didn't include a right in the first 8, you still may have that right, right? There are unenumerated rights that human beings have. And we're not trying to present an exhaustive list of them here. So on that basis, the Griswold decision about birth control for married people, followed by a second decision in 72 or 73, extending that right to contraception to unmarried people, and other laws quickly followed, outlawing marriage laws that prevent people from marrying across races, outlawing providing for same-sex marriage in a more recent decision, another decision about banning anti-sodomy laws. What all these laws have in common is that they involve bodily integrity and bodily autonomy. They're private things that, you know, on reflection, a lot of people, even in 1965, would agree that married people in Connecticut should have the right to birth control. So that's the preface to what I want to say. A case came up in the Supreme Court in 1997, and it was about physician-assisted suicide. And in that case, I mean, there's a similarity in that to the other decisions because it's about bodily autonomy and being able to have control of decisions about how your body operates or doesn't operate in that case. And the justices found that they were not going to put that in under the same basis as this. And in fact, they went a step further in not extending it to that by putting language into their decision about history and traditions. This is where that phrase enters the lexicon of the court. They worried, it is said, that at the time, that any 5 justices on a Supreme Court could decide that something was a right that people had, and there would be no way to check them on that because, you know, they're there for life and there's no way to counter it. And so they said, anytime we want to add a new right to the Constitution under this due process clause, it needs to be something that has a substantial history and tradition already in the American life. And that is why the history of abortion matters so much to making these decisions. I'll return to this at the end, but let me just let it go there. The key claim in Dobbs then is that in 1868, when the 14th Amendment was ratified, the word liberty was injected into the Constitution there. And in 1868, 28 out of the 37 existing states had outlawed abortion. Therefore, it can't be that any of those legislators who passed and ratified the Constitution, not just the men in Congress, but the men, and they were all men, in all of the state legislatures that ratified that amendment, they could not have been thinking of abortion as a liberty. It's just mutually exclusive. So liberty can't be a right because it is, it was made illegal everywhere. They've expressed themselves on that. Now, there are 2 ways to challenge that kind of argument, and one way is to look closely at the laws themselves, because they made this argument based on the laws, right? 28 out of 37 states prohibited abortion, and all they have to do is say they had a law against abortion. But it's important to look at those laws. They're not all uniform. They didn't come into existence at the same time. They were addressing different needs, perhaps, than what the Supreme Court people think they were addressing. So it's important to do an analysis of the statutes, and it's also important to get some sense of what the statutes were trying to address. What was the social problem at the time that brought these laws into existence? Laws that then replaced the common law in those states. And so that's one way of arguing against this logic here set up by the Dobbs decision. Another way to argue against it is to say, wait a minute, are we going to only have rights that people had in 1868? You know, isn't there some possibility that they didn't think of everything by 1868? We can think of a lot of things that have accrued to our legal system since 1868. Are corporations people? You know, maybe that's not what they were thinking then. That would be one thing to address. Another one, a logical one, would be employment discrimination based on sex. You know, there were some women who saw the 14th Amendment and said in the 1860s and 70s, wow, that means I'm entitled to all of these rights. And they brought suits that went all the way to the Supreme Court on employment discrimination questions. And they were told by the Supreme Court, oh, we didn't have you in mind when we passed this amendment. You know, and it was only in the 1960s that 14th Amendment cases supporting women's rights began to be passed. So it took us a long time to get out of that kind of logic, but the dissent that the 3 dissenting justices filed in Dobbs essentially took on this second question and said, if we follow the logic of this decision, all of those other bodily rights that we now think are secure are insecure. So, okay. So my outline for today is I'm going to talk about medical and public knowledge about abortion at the time. I'm going to address the question of why those statutes were passed. And I'm going to talk about the campaign to criminalize abortion in a big way that was put together by the American Medical Association in 1860 to really beef up the laws against abortion in this country. So those are my 3 topics I'm going to cover here. Let's see. We'll go to the next card here. First, a word about quickening, the word that appears in the common law discussions of abortion. It's a period of a pregnancy that can be variable depending on the woman and depending on the pregnancy. We say most of the time a woman can feel the child stirring 18 to 22 weeks into pregnancy. And the question is, why did the common law make this such a big deal, right? Some people argue that it's an evidentiary question, that it's only when a woman can feel the child move that you can be sure that she's pregnant and that you can be sure that she's carrying a live child. And therefore, in a legal courtroom where you're charging someone with abortion, it's important to know these facts, perhaps. Other people had different ideas about this. There is an ancient tradition of talking about a moment of conception when the fertilized egg first asserts itself, and ensoulment, the moment when the soul of this human being to be enters into that conception moment. And in some writings of Aristotle, I think he put it at 40 days, and the Catholic Church at some times has said it was 40 days for men, 80 days for females. I could have those, anyway. But you get the idea. There is some space of time, people are thinking, between when the first blastula is formed and a real set of cells on its way to becoming a human being. Some doctors in the 19th century said foolish women believe that they're only pregnant when they can feel the baby. And up until then, they don't even know they're pregnant. And I've seen that asserted countless times in medical literature in the 19th century. And I think that's utterly wrong. And probably most of you, if you've had 1 or 2 children, have some familiarity with why you might think you were pregnant before quickening. But they were convinced that the reason the quickening doctrine was just because of foolish old women, and now that we all know better, we should get rid of the quickening doctrine. Some people, well, just to say a little more about what women can know, there were lists in physiology books of the 19th century about the signs and symptoms of pregnancy, and they're pretty much the same ones you'd find in any book today. Cessation of menstruation, sensation that the breasts are swelling and getting larger, nausea and vomiting, and a few others that I can't think of right offhand, but every time they'd print a list like that, it says everything on this list could be something else. And even if you have a lot of them, you can't know for sure you're pregnant. And maybe it's hard for us to remember a time when we didn't have rabbit tests and the things you can buy in the drugstore and other methods of proving that pregnancy exists. But in those days, they really didn't have anything. So maybe what we really could say is that women could perhaps know that if they didn't tell anyone, maybe other people didn't know, right? There's a recent book out in 2019 called Lost, a whole book about the history of miscarriage, which makes this point very nicely, and I should give the author credit, Shannon Withicombe. She's studied lots of women's letters and diaries, mostly married women, reflecting on their pregnancy and how they felt about it, and writing letters to their mothers and their sisters, and some of them are happy to be pregnant and then experience miscarriage and feel a sense of loss, as many people do today under those circumstances. But she found a fair number of women, writing mom and saying, I think I'm pregnant, and then a few months later the letter is, guess what, great, I'm not pregnant, So a kind of relief and joy even in finding that you've had a miscarriage. All of that is only possible if we postulate that these women can understand that they're pregnant fairly at some early point into the pregnancy. Okay. The new features of the 19th century. Oh, actually, I wanted to back up and say one other thing before I get to this, while you contemplate these weapons of mass destruction up there. I'm talking about the 19th century because everything changed in the 19th century. It has been said in the past that women have always had abortions. And in theory, that is true. Some women have probably always had abortions. The practice of disrupting a pregnancy is something that most people could probably figure out how to do. But it's hard to do. You have to have care to not get infected or not get stabbed in the wrong places. I mean, it's not easy to do, but the concept of it is available to people. But when I look at the 18th and the 17th century in America, what I see are large families. You know, the whole concept of family limitation has not taken hold yet in the population. Women can be married for 20 years between age 22 and 42 and have 10 kids. I think in Puritan New England, where the calculations have been done based on those wonderful city records, town records that were kept in places like Massachusetts in the 17th and 18th century, where you go in and just count how many children are happening to families. And somebody who did this in a very scientific way found that the average interval between births for a woman in the 17th century was something like 26 months. So, you know, occasionally they'll have a child that drops out because of miscarriage or early death and it doesn't get recorded. But this is a population, not just in New England, but we think in all of the other colonies too, that basically is experiencing unrestricted fertility. And so finding abortion as a choice, as a conscious choice of restricting fertility is going to be pretty uncommon. The other reason to say that it wasn't much happening, or the other pool of people beyond married women to look to, are unmarried women. These are the people in the 19th century who present in the newspapers with the most compelling reason for wanting an abortion. That is, they're out of wedlock. Pregnancy is going to ruin them. The social stigma of having engaged in sex before marriage was so powerful that they were driven to abortion by that fact. In the 18th century, for about 40 years, between the 1740s and the 1780s, in New England again, because that's where the records are, but we have anecdotal evidence from other colonies that's not dissimilar. When you look at these records and look at the date of marriage and the date of, oh, wait, I got in the wrong place. When you look at, when you look at these records and find couples who got married, I was in the right place. You look at the date of marriage and you look at the birth of the first child, and in that 40-year period, up to 30, maybe even 40% in some towns of the marriages being contracted are with couples who are going to have a baby sooner than 9 months. And what that tells you is that this is not unusual, that people have a way to cope with this. In these small communal towns where everybody knows everybody else, if you get pregnant, you get married, right? It's an auspicious sign that you should marry this person because it's your duty to do it too. And the community can enforce marriage on these couples, so there isn't this stigma of unwed motherhood. And for the occasional women who had a child out of wedlock because they were a servant and the master was a high-status man who's in no position to marry him, those were kind of casually handled too. The babies were born. They were kept by the mother sometimes. In some famous cases, the babies were taken by the father's family and taken care of. So the market for abortion wasn't powerful in the 18th century. That's the long-winded point I'm trying to make here. Now, in the 19th century, things change. The stigma on unwed motherhood goes way up for reasons that would take way too long to explain. And the birth rate starts falling probably in the 1840s. That's the best evidence we have. And we have some families, of course, that are still living in the old way of having child after child and having, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14 children. And then you start seeing more families of 6, 5, 4, and 3 children. So there's a mentality of family limitation setting in. And there are means to accomplish it. There are birth control means, which I won't be talking about tonight, but they really did exist. They're not, as I tell my students, anything you would want to use at home. They're imprecise and not always reliable, but over the long haul, they can reduce fertility significantly in a large population. There are new medical tools on the scene and new ways of training doctors, and basically an incursion of trained male doctors moving into the field of male midwifery. But let's look at their tool chest first. They're new tools, and the most prominent one is the uterine sound, the long thing on the right. In theory, something like this could be suggested to the mind of anyone looking for a way to abort a baby. But what was new in the 1840s about the new sound was that it had a little soft metal, not soft, well, silver is a little soft, a metal ball on the top to prevent it from puncturing any tissues, and little markers on the handle so that the person using it can know by his thumb exactly how far into the uterus he's gone, so he's not going to go too far. And also be able to kind of judge the stage of pregnancy, too. This would disrupt the membrane, and the practice in abortion and deliberate abortion was to do this to a woman who would then be sent home, or if she's unmarried, sent to a lodging house where the doctor has an agreement with the lodging housekeeper, and within 1 to 5 or 6 days, labor would set in, and the contents of the uterus would be expelled, and hopefully all would be well, but not always. So the uterine sound is an important thing. Forceps and the speculum you've probably heard of. There had been forceps before. The speculum was invented and developed, I guess, in the 1840s. A trocar was this item down on the bottom here, a pointy, sharp instrument with a hollow core in it, and it was used by doctors to drain liquids out of areas where liquids shouldn't be, like draining blood out of some cavity somewhere in the body. But it was adaptable as an abortion instrument because if you had one that was open at this end here, you could insert it into the uterus, and that's very painful, as you might imagine. And so let me speak for a moment about ether and chloroform, both invented and starting to be used in the mid-1840s. All these things are happening about the same time. Anyway, you could use this tool and put a wire up in it, and I've seen descriptions of that, and then the wire does the job of puncturing the membrane. The drugs that are available, there are many drugs that have been talked about as appearing in midwives' manuals over the centuries, but the ones I saw in my study, and I haven't actually mentioned my study yet, I went through 19th century databases of newspapers and collected 225 abortion stories from 1820 to 1860. And so this is how I learned a lot about what actually happened. And the drugs that were most often used were these tansy, savin, and ergot. And ergot is a drug that actually does induce uterine contractions. And doctors used it sometimes to speed up a very slow labor. And there was a lot of debate in the medical literature about how much and how strong and when to use it. And some people saying it can never be used to initiate labor because that doesn't work. And others would say, oh, no, it does work, I can tell you. So the other two are plant-based medications that if you got it in the wrong dosage or the wrong format, it could kill you. So these are used again and again, which I conclude means that it was somewhat efficacious. But tansy, for example, was sold. All of these were sold in apothecaries everywhere. I mean, I was surprised by that. Some little place in Hancock, Massachusetts, in the western part of the state, or Elyria, Ohio, population 900, had an apothecary where you could go in and get this stuff. But tansy, in the oil form, you can use it in those days to rub on skin eruptions and rashes of various kinds. But if you're a poor, unknowledgeable young woman fearing to be pregnant and you go to your apothecary and you ask for tansy, they might give you oil of tansy rather than the real tansy. And I came across a number of cases where a woman's death resulted from that kind of mistake on her part. You know, she's not telling the druggist what she needs it for. She's just buying tansy. Okay. Amenorrhea. This is what the uterine probe was meant to be used for. This is the design of it by doctors, was to probe the uterus, not for abortions, but because of a condition called amenorrhea. In obstetrical texts of the 19th century, almost always the beginning chapters were about amenorrhea, dysmenorrhea, and some third version of that word. And it's a condition where a woman hasn't had a menstrual period for 1, 2, or 3 cycles, and she'd be advised to consult a doctor at that point, because this could be a sign of very serious problems. If it's blocked in some way, if the fluid is there and it can't get out, maybe the cervix is blocked, maybe there's an imperforate hymen, all of these different possibilities. And doctors felt it was an urgent matter to treat them. And here I have a quotation from a medical text, and this is quite a late one from 1858. By the end of the 19th century, they're not saying this anymore. We may hence understand why menstruation is, as all experience testifies, so essential to the female health. Why? When it is morbidly suppressed, the whole system suffers, and when it is restored, the glow of health revisits the cheeks. So he imagines his patients coming in with this problem, and he probes their uterus, and it restores the flow within a day or two, and they have a glow in their cheeks after that. All of these books, pretty much all of these books say, be sure to ask, make sure that the woman's not pregnant. But how are you going to know that if you can't tell someone's pregnant until quickening? A woman who actually wanted an abortion could go in and say, I'm sure I'm not pregnant because I haven't had connection with my husband for 3 months or something like that. So, it's kind of a don't ask, don't tell situation that opens the door. I think this is really kind of the understudied aspect of abortion in the 19th century, and where a lot of it might have been happening. But there were other reasons why people would use those tools, and to look for tumors or other growths in the uterus too would be part of what they'd be looking for. Okay. Medical training of doctors here. You should not think of doctors in the 19th century as being the highly trained professionals that we have today. The typical course of study at a medical college for a person who actually was going to medical college is you did 3 years apprenticing to a local doctor who would then write you a letter of recommendation. And if you only did 1 or 2, he might still write you a letter of recommendation. And this would be, at a young stage of your life. And then you would go off to a medical college and take, in some cases, 2 semesters worth of work, but in many cases, for the newer schools, 1 semester worth of courses. And you'd write a thesis, and that's it, and you get your MD. So the quantity of training here is scant, and the theses are supposed to demonstrate the powers of mind that these people have been trained to exhibit. And I've read a number of these. They exist in libraries, and they kind of look to me like papers some of my beginning students might write after they're just trying to write down what you said in lecture, right? They are not researched. They are, they're very, very insubstantial in the most cases. I'm sure that there were others that were better, but this is not a training system that's going to give you a first-class medical establishment. Many more medical colleges were founded. There were some in Philadelphia and in New York and Boston, but by the 1830s and 40s, there was one in, Fairfield, New York, and Castleton, Vermont, and here and there. It didn't take much to set up a medical college, actually. No clinical training in any of these, most of these medical colleges. The male doctors wanted to express their expertise over women's bodies by entering midwifery, and they called it male midwifery up until the 1840s. And then they decided that the word obstetrics was a much more professional sounding word, and male midwifery disappeared at that time. These were doctors, though, that were very interested in sharing knowledge with other people, sharing knowledge out of their experiences in treating patients. So many, many medical journals were being published, something like 150 of them by the 1840s and 50s. And they really are an amazing set of books. And then these doctors also got together in the counties they lived in and formed medical societies. What I'm describing for you is a kind of infrastructure where doctors get to know each other. They have a communication means through journals and through medical societies. And this is an infrastructure that will be mobilized in the 1850s to make changes in the laws. I've read a lot of these medical journals. It's wonderful to find them online because you can search in them, and there are very few articles about abortion until the 1850s. So it's not on the radar there. The public knowledge, that's the medical knowledge that's spreading and changing things. There's a kind of public knowledge of abortion that emerges too in the late 1830s and 40s. This is all, you're getting the idea that that's an important time point in this story here. Newspapers started taking advertisements from bring on your blocked menstrual period, for example. Female monthly pills, the sure and never failing regulator of the menses and remover of menstrual obstruction. We used to read this as out-and-out code for abortionists, and after reading about the actual legitimate uses of the uterine sound, I don't think that's it. I think it's somewhere in between. There's a moment of slippage, I guess, when you move from a medical practice that's just trying to treat actual, what they imagine are actual problems, but they're actually possibly inducing abortions as well. And so the newspapers are full of these kinds of ads, and let me just go to two from New York. The lower one is from the famous Madame Restell, promising her pills, and another one from Madame Costello. They start calling themselves female physicians, and in the 1840s, these ads are all over newspapers at the time. And nobody is stopping them here. Here's just a cartoon I'll pause on but not decode for you. It's a cartoon or a lithograph made in 1840 of Madame Restell's parlor. She was the most famous abortionist in America. Her name became synonymous with the practice of abortion. And here she has a parlor full of very visibly pregnant women. And the cartoonist probably didn't know that Madame Restell preferred not to treat women who were visibly pregnant. I've found accounts of her turning away people who are too late. She wanted to limit her practice to early abortions. But one of the questions about a picture like that is who made it and why and who bought it? You know, this is a market phenomenon. And my answer to that, I think, would be there's a whole set of racy young men inhabiting big cities at the time, and they buy all kinds of pictures that smack of anything to do with sex, and they post them in barbershops and other male institutions. Oops, went away. Okay, let me just make sure I'm in the right place. Actual practice of abortions. I mentioned that I did this big newspaper study. I'll probably push it past 1860. I found a number of features out of doing this research. One is that of all those events I found, 80% of them were events happening to single women, and very few to married women. And of the married women, half of the married women were kind of in the same situation as a single woman in that they were women whose husbands weren't living with them. They were away in the gold fields or out to sea, or, you know, their pregnancy was something they needed to be ashamed of. So they're resorting to abortion to hide their shame. And that was a phrase I saw again and again in these newspaper accounts here. The single women are framed almost always in these accounts as seduced maidens, innocent women who bought the blandishments of their lovers and were sure that he was going to marry them, and then of course he didn't, and they wind up trying to have an abortion. Out of all these cases, they didn't, there's kind of a pattern to a surge in these cases that goes on with time. I found 0 cases in any American newspaper before 1820. And that's probably because either there weren't very many abortions, but also newspapers were much more circumspect in those days. There's a revolution in journalism in the 1830s toward a more lurid, sensationalist style of communicating and gaining readers, right? And so there are actually still few cases before 1840, a big surge in the 1840s, even bigger surge in the 1850s, and then in the last half of the 1850s, half of the number of cases I found came in those 5 years. So there degree of abortions happening probably, but an accelerating abortions. My sources, or their sources, I should say, the newspaper sources, was usually the coroner's inquest. And so if you consider that for a moment, you'll realize that these are mostly cases where the woman died. That's why it's going to wind up in the coroner's inquest. The doctors were not so much the lady physicians, but male doctors. They were almost all post-quickening abortions, not quickening abortions. And keep in mind that quickening is a really important feature of this story. There's zero attention to the fetus, in print anyway. It's important only to establish whether it was the gestational age of the fetus. But there's no particular solicitude or concern or a description of two people dying, which we do get later on in the 1860s. In this earlier phase, that doesn't enter into it. And this is what I claim to be the kind of public knowledge. Oh, these cases fly from newspaper to newspaper because they're so good at attracting eyeballs, right? And so a case that happens in Boston can be in Ohio papers 3 or 4 days later, and out in California a week later. And the Telegraph makes this possible. The Pony Express makes this possible. Newspapers all exchanged papers with each other in those days, so news traveled quite fast. And it's not probably far wrong to say there's a national conversation on abortion that can happen around these cases. Okay. The statutes. Let's correlate the surge in cases with the surge in statutes. There are no statute laws on abortion in America until the 1820s. So that's everybody's cool with common law. No concern about pre-quickening abortions. And then you get some in the 20s, more in the 30s, a lot more in the 40s, because this story is heating up. Fewer in the 50s, strangely, there, but maybe that's because all those other states have passed laws. There will be a point of diminishing returns here. But then in the 1860s, 12 new laws get passed. So something's happening in the 1860s, which I'll be talking about. Some of these state laws simply codify common law. So there are statutes that do nothing other than what the common law already did, and they write it down. And 2 of those states are Mississippi and Arkansas. Mississippi, which was the cause in the action that we saw in Dobbs, didn't change that law until 1904. So basically, okay, some of these laws are what scholars now call hybrid laws. That is, they retain the quickening distinction, but they make the pre-quick abortion much lesser penalty. And then for post-quickening, it's whatever that state is going to make it. So one is maybe a misdemeanor and the other a felony. One is 1 to 12 months in jail. The post-quickening abortion might be 1 to 12 years in jail or prison sentences. They're honoring the difference between early and late abortion still in these laws, a large number of hybrid laws. Some of these laws just say any pregnant woman. And if you're not a shrewd reader, you might think that means like any stage of pregnancy, any pregnant woman can have an abortion under this law. But actually, if you don't know a woman's pregnant until a certain point, there's an ambiguity about that, that can be played with a little bit. Maybe she isn't pregnant, and maybe you're using an instrument on her for another reason. There was one case I found where a doctor claimed he was innocent because he was using the uterine sound only to check and see how far along the pregnancy was, right? He didn't mean to abort her. And then the husband stepped up, and it was actually the husband bringing suit here because the wife died. And he said, actually, we hired you to do the abortion, so I know it was an abortion, right? So strange thinking there. Some of these laws only prohibited medicine abortions and say nothing about instruments. So does that mean instruments are okay? It's not against the law. It's not in the law. And some of these states had no laws at all, because if Dobbs tells you that 28 out of 37 had laws, that leaves another, whatever the residual is, to be states that had no law. We're still under common law. There were some states that introduced legislation to curb abortion, and it was voted down. It didn't make it through the 3 readings, the standard 3 readings of a bill in the legislature. It might get past the first reading, but fail on the second reading. And that kind of tells you that not everyone is on board with saying, oh, abortion should be illegal. Why didn't we think of this before? We'll do it now. And those 2 states that I have in mind are Pennsylvania, where a lot of abortion cases were happening in Philadelphia, and Georgia, which I think didn't think it had a problem. Okay, let me move along here. What I found in the cases in the newspapers was that there were very few cases that actually made it from the coroner's jury to the grand jury, and very few that made it out of the grand jury and were chargeable. Fewer trials, acquittals were common. There's kind of the general picture is one of tolerance. Maybe that's not the right word, but you know, maybe the evidence wasn't firm enough. Actually, there was one case in San Francisco in the 1870s that really surprised me, out of my time range here, but where a 13-year-old girl had an abortion and died, and the relatives of the girl were bringing suit of some kind. And the doctor was convicted, but had it overturned at the state Supreme Court in California because, the girl didn't die for a while. There was a time when she was alive and could be a witness of a kind of a dying death declaration. And the court said, we don't accept the word of a woman, this 13-year-old girl. So she's the only, her aunt and brother are out in the waiting room waiting for this procedure, and they've come to a man who I can track through abortion trials from Maine to California. It was his profession, shall we say, and the judge resorted to the idea that some women are not competent witnesses in trials. So it's a picture of not very severe actions on abortions. And so now I'm finally at my third part here. This is the guy, Horatio Storer, who single-handedly, although he got other hands on deck soon, decided that abortion should be banned and criminalized and severely punished throughout the country. He blamed married women in particular for having more abortions, and actually, with my new insight about amenorrhea being a form of abortion happening, he probably wasn't wrong to suspect that more women were postponing and regulating their childbearing that way. He didn't coin the word criminal abortion, but after he used it, it was injected into the language. You can rarely find the term criminal abortion in any newspaper before the late 1850s. And he made it the term of the day. And after that, newspapers really start using the word a lot. He was active in the American Medical Association. His father was and he himself trained at Harvard. He was very young. He was 27 when he started on this campaign and pretty full of himself. And he insisted that women should be penalized too, which a few states actually already did. But they regretted doing it because once you penalize the woman, you lose your witness, right? So, because often in these cases, it's the woman who is going to, the other person in the room when the crime happened, and you want to get her testimony. But he thought that there ought to be punitive penalties for women because women were disavowing their nature. Their nature was to get married and have children, and they are overturning nature by resorting to abortions. He got his local medical society in Suffolk County, Boston, to gather together and hear his report on criminal abortion. These were people who were his friends that he saw monthly at these meetings, and half of them were on board with him, but the other half raised really good questions. And one of the questions was, what happens to those of us who do amenorrhea treatments with uterine sounds? And one of the doctors, this is one I did want to read here. Let me see if I've got it here. Darn, gone through a lot of cards without doing this. Suppose, this is Henry Bigelow, a very famous Boston doctor. Suppose a mother of several children, which she has in rapid succession, and the physician feels assured that health and possible life will be endangered if another pregnancy occurs. Would he be criminal if he were to use a common means for amenorrhea if the menses have been absent for 6 weeks? He's basically pointing to the fact that doctors had this discretion to help out a woman in those circumstances, and he's actually doing it himself, one would assume from this. Other people said, what about the woman with the small pelvis? Somebody's got to help her out. How can we let her run the risk of getting pregnant again and facing death that way? And Storer replied at this meeting. He was getting angrier and angrier as the meeting went on. We have these wonderful set of manuscript minutes of the meeting. And he said, a woman with a small pelvis, what if she comes in 5 times asking for abortion? Should we still take care of her problem all those times. We should not be underwriting lust in this country. Her husband should be castrated, which probably wasn't a winning argument in a room full of men. But he was fierce about this, and that's why, for several decades, scholars studying abortion have identified him as kind of the big bad guy of the time, pushing this through. But he was ingenious, actually, at using the infrastructure of the medical associations and the larger American Medical Association to make this happen. So he did it fairly well. Whoops. At this meeting, some people said to him, we just actually don't encounter this very much in our practice. You got to prove to us this is a problem. So he went away for about 6 months and came back with a statistical report that proved abortions were happening everywhere all at once in large numbers. And this report became the heart of the pitch that the American Medical Association, he moved them in the direction of sending a packet of papers, including a statistical report, to every legislature, every governor in the country, to the president, and to the Congress. And they all got this, and it was covered with a note signed by the man who was the head of the Medical Association, the man Miller, whose patients left his office with their cheeks warmed, glowing for their success. Storer ghosted the letter for him, and the letter said, "These figures shall not be questioned. These figures are correct." Every time he published these figures, he always had that admonition. No one had corrected him yet. But he actually, I think I might be the first person in 150 years to read this report carefully. And as Rebecca said, my first book was called A Calculating People, The Rise of Numeracy in Early America. I'm alert to these data problems of the past. And he had gone through statistical registers from New York and from Massachusetts, had looked at the number of stillbirths in the death records and the number of premature births in the death records. And this is a report that recaps how many there were and at what age the person died from the various diseases. And you can see that there's a large number of premature births. And I guess you can see over in the column, this is under a year, 172 of these are babies that died in the first year of life, which we would call infant mortality, right? But these were like underweight, undersized babies that were born early. Storer took them to all be abortions, and he starts calling them abortions in his report. And so he got fantastically large numbers. And then when he tried to manufacture a number that we would recognize, that is the number of abortions compared to the number of births, getting birth data was really hard in those days. There was no incentive for people to register births, except in New England towns where they all want to keep their lifelines going or their family trees going. But death data was pretty secure because that was something that needed officially to be logged in anytime anyone got buried. The sexton has to see a death certificate signed by a doctor. And so the death certificates are remarkably reliable, we think, for the 19th century, but the birth records are not. So if you take this inflated number of premature births, which really were babies born that were just underweight and early, and then died in large numbers as they moved through their first year of life, and you put that on top of a denominator that is your guess, your best guess as to the number of births that year, you can get a pretty unreliable number. And the number he came up with for that was 1 in 40.4 births was an abortion. And then when he published this data several more times, he published it in a best-selling book, and a decimal point got moved. Mm-hmm. And it was reported to be 1 in 4.04 births ending in abortion. Those numbers would make the legislatures panic, right? I mean, this is a moral panic being created by this one-man band. In the brief that I helped prepare for the Supreme Court, we put a lot of this in, and I got my data in, and the lawyers who were working with us wanted me to check it very carefully because they didn't want to have a mistake in there. And so I got all these old records from Massachusetts and New York and showed them to them, and they finally agreed. And so Alito had access to that information, and in his decision he says, you know, what's in the mind of one man? We can't know. And we really can't know what's in the minds of all the legislatures either when they're writing these laws. So why even try, I guess? But then he is deciding that he knows what's in their mind, that they're trying to save babies, right? But he dismissed this, and he said, well, Storer, he didn't even name him by name. This one man, he was sincere. But sincerity doesn't cut it for me, and actually I don't think he was sincere. I think every time he published this data, he'd say, well, it must be right because no one's contradicted me yet, right? And in another article he wrote, he said, that wasn't about birth statistics, he said, it's possible to lie with statistics. I mean, he admitted the whole thing that you can make numbers say anything you want them to say. I need to hustle along here because I'm probably way over time. But he had this data that alarmed the country. It played on archaic notions of women's nature and their duty to have children. There was another hidden element to this that came to the fore, the differential birth rates between immigrants, Irish and Catholic immigrants and German immigrants coming with their higher birth rates. And I have just one clip from an article called Dying Out from a Christian magazine in Boston that went on about, can it be that the grand mission of the Anglo-Saxon race in America will soon terminate? Heaven forfend, you know, we're going to die out here. If so, it will be its own fault, its own crime. In this thing, our American women should know the full measure of their responsibility. So the blame is on women for doing this. And this is just one isolated article. There are lots of articles one can find this sentiment in here. Okay, so last two slides. What did Dobbs get wrong? The reliance on counting the statutes, I think, is insufficient. You have to know what the statutes say. Not all of them were so focused on saving babies, right? In fact, probably few of them were. Extensive non-compliance with the laws should somehow matter. I guess some real legal eagle would tell me that I'm wrong about that the law is the law and you don't look at other things. But I'm really impressed by how tolerant the culture was toward abortion at the time. They were not happy about women's deaths. I think these statutes are about women's deaths. They're not about abortion. They're about people feeling sorrow over the tragedy of these needless deaths of the women, and something needs to be done about that. These attitudes are reflected in the fact that there are almost no pre-quick abortions anywhere, even in the states where it's illegal. You don't find them in the courts. Now, that could be because these are successful abortions for the most times, and they don't wind up with dead bodies. But it's, you know, the change in laws didn't make a big change in practice. And I think the court showed bad faith in dismissing this whole lobbying campaign by the AMA. So the larger wrong of Dobbs, this is my last slide, pinning reproductive rights to that moment in 1868 when the 14th Amendment was passed, I think is a big mistake. Pinning it on a frame of mind then that really had gender and ethnic discriminatory attitudes in mind should rule it out as the basis for public policy in our own time. Those are impermissible bases for public policy here. If you want to find the history and tradition of abortion in this country, you could look to the 19th century, but why not look to the 50 years we just had? That's kind of a long time where we've agreed that abortion is something that people should have bodily autonomy over. And the dissenting opinion in Dobbs really made this point very clearly, that the legal reasoning used in this argument can be mobilized to be used against all of those other laws, and we're probably going to see that at some point. So I think that's the end of it here. Yes, okay. Sorry if I went on too long.
Yes, I do. I may need the clicker, though. Thank you so much. Let's see. And then... Hi, everybody. Give me 1 second. Do this. Okay. And then slideshow. Okay. Hi. I'm going to try to go quick because I know some folks may want to go and have dinner or get their evening started. My name is Lina-Maria Murillo, and I am a historian here at the University of Iowa. As you probably heard from my introduction, I write about the U.S.-Mexico borderland, and I specifically look at the history of Mexican origin women in the region. However, because of this IPR interview, I had to talk about Iowa, and that's not normally the space I'm looking at, the region I'm looking at. However, I was really fortunate that one of the sort of founding historians of the field, James Moore, wrote an article about the history of abortion in the 1980s, and he was able to use sources here at the University of Iowa, and he was a meticulous footnoter, so I was able to sort of look through his footnotes. And a different argument appeared for me, and this is what's sort of fascinating about history, is that you can use the same primary source documents and sort of glean different stories, different narratives. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. But I'm going to try to do a little bit of what Professor Cohen did, which is kind of give you a little bit of background and unite our histories, right? She stopped in the mid-19th century, and I'm going to bring us from that midpoint into the mid to late 20th century. And obviously, we're having this conversation because we no longer have a constitutional right to abortion in the United States. And as Professor Cohen said, this leads into a slew of other decisions around bodily autonomy. And so I want to bring you to Iowa of the late 1960s and early 1970s to understand how our state began discussing liberalizing abortion laws during a moment when lots of other states were doing the same. They were grappling with questions about access to abortion. But I want to bridge that divide, right? So the first thing I want to say is that as states began to pass abortion restrictions in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, women continued to have abortions. And a note on language, before I continue, I should say, I'm going to use the term woman or women in the historical context, as this is how most people seeking abortions would have identified themselves during that time. Of course, today when we talk about abortion, we should try to use gender-neutral language because trans and non-binary people also have abortions. Now, physicians and lay practitioners, including midwives, as we just learned, continue to offer the procedure to women, often to those who could pay throughout this period, right, throughout the sort of criminalization period in the US. And this tells us that you cannot legislate away abortion. You cannot criminalize it away. You cannot punish, jail, or execute providers or those who need abortions into oblivion. Our society, since time immemorial, has used various methods and technologies to control reproduction and fertility. And as Professor Cohen rightly said, you see waves up and down of when people decide to practice that kind of reproductive control. And people have, as I said, been doing so for a very long time. This is part of our human history, and nothing any religious or secular group can say or do to change the fact that abortion will persist because it is part of our human existence. In fact, I was just at an incredible workshop on the history of abortion at Johns Hopkins University this last weekend with historians of medieval history, with historians who are looking at early modern history, and the words that we use to describe abortion or pregnancy loss have changed and ebbed and flowed over time, right? So this is also important. What are the words that we use to describe pregnancy loss? The second thing I'll say, I've got Horatio stored too. He was so important. We should stop and think about this man. So while historians have focus on the campaign to criminalize abortion in the 19th century as one that was led by physicians, like Mr. Storer here, seeking to professionalize their careers. Another critical aspect, and Professor Cohen talked about this for a moment, centered on fears of demographic decline. And this is going to be a major sort of theme throughout my history that I'm going to present tonight. Horatio Storer, the physician who directed the campaign to criminalize abortion in the U.S. during the 19th century, made clear that as the U.S. gained new territories in the West, and this is in the wake of the U.S. war with Mexico, where the United States gained massive tracts of land west of the Mississippi. Here I'm talking about California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and of course we have Texas. That white Anglo-Saxon Protestants would need to ratchet up their fertility in order to provide the proper racial and religious population to dominate this new area of the country. And Horatio Storer spoke adamantly about this. And this is also this had a lot to do with the expansion of slavery before the Civil War and the possibility that there might be abolition, right? The demographic fears were tightly wrapped around questions about including new non-white peoples who had been living in the new American frontier, and this is including Native peoples, Mexicans, Black, formerly enslaved people, and new immigrants, such as the Chinese. Not to mention the massive amount of immigration that we were getting from Europe of non-Anglo-Saxon countries, right? And so these anxieties also contributed to Horatio Storer's campaign. And so here I'm thinking about sociologists Nicola Bessel and Tamara Kay, who have written about abortion in the 19th century and have thought about the power of white supremacy as central to Horatio Storer's campaign, right? And so they say claims that physicians played on fears of independent women missed what was at stake during the battles to end legalized abortion in the 19th century, Anglo-Saxon control of the state and dominance of society. And so here we have Iowa. In July 19, and I'm going to read, and I apologize for that. Like I said, this is very new for me. So I wrote a lot about this, but this is still very new for me. So in July 1970, the Des Moines Register published a poll that surveyed residents across the state of Iowa, confirming, quote, overpopulation as the greatest fear as the new decade began. 3/4 of adults in Iowa, quote, worried about the possibility that the world population might double in the next 40 years. Consequently, of those polled, a majority believed that family planning, education, and birth control were key to averting global catastrophe. Iowans were not singular in this fear. This poll came out 2 years after Paul Ehrlich wrote the infamous population bomb, right? So this had stirred quite a bit of overpopulation fears, although in my book I write about the fact that these overpopulation fears or concerns about demographic change are very much part of the history of the United States that we are yet to sort of unpack and discuss. And then I found Jane Moore's article, the historian who I was talking about earlier, who in his 1989 article on the history of abortion in Iowa says that overpopulation fears was the #1 reason why Iowans began to consider liberalizing abortion laws in the state. That was the #1 reason. Then came questions around accessing abortion services and equity. The next one was physicians who were concerned about being criminalized for offering abortion. And last on the list was the women's rights movement, right? So he creates that. And this is all before Roe, right? So this is in the 1968, 1969. Still, as I'm reading this, I'm thinking to myself, the threat of overpopulation in Iowa, how can that be? Historians of reproduction, abortion, and population control understand the long and often complicated history that entwines battles for reproductive freedom and reproductive control. And yet the fixation on overpopulation in a historically rural state like Iowa does not seem to add up. Right? Recent legislators, and I'm talking about recently, this is an analysis from 2010, recent legislative analysis of demographic data in Iowa conclude that Iowa has long been a slow-growing state. While the U.S. population more than doubled between 1950 and 2010, Iowa's population grew by a minuscule 16%. Now, even amid the growing anxiety of a burgeoning global population in the 1970s, some Iowans, such as Robert Spiegel, editor of the Mason City, Iowa Globe Gazette, tried unconvincingly to quell their fears. Quote, "Drive through pleasant green and gold Iowa in the autumn," he wrote, "and you can find acres of cropland with the occasional service center. The land is open and inviting. The state's 2.8 million people have elbow room enough for all, some might say." He proclaimed erroneously that, quote, "certainly there is no population panic here in the heartland." Right? Perhaps he had missed this Des Moines Register poll describing the opposite only a few months prior. Or maybe Spiegel's pronouncement was wishful thinking, since many Iowa periodicals in the late 1960s and 1970s dedicated much time and ink to the overpopulation scare. At the same time, those opposed to abortion liberalization in Iowa, many of them acknowledged these overpopulation fears, as they simultaneously touted the growing loss of, quote, Christian values and moral decay that would surely besiege their state if abortion laws became less restrictive. As debate over abortion heated up in the Iowa legislature beginning in 1969, constituents wrote hundreds of letters to their legislators declaring these concerns. One Des Moines resident exclaimed, quote, "We can talk about overpopulation and other ills, but to correct one wrong with another, liberalizing abortion laws, is idiotic," he stated. Another resident, this time from Waterloo, wrote, quote, "What happens to the morals of a country when a person can decide if he is to kill an unborn baby or not? What has happened in Russia or in Sweden?" I'll talk about that in a second. Another Black Hawk County couple pleaded with legislators to, quote, "please, in the consciences of motherhood, Americanism, and humanism, vote no on loosening abortion laws in Iowa." In an attempt to halt further discussion about abortion access in Iowa, residents evoked this new holy trinity of motherhood, Americanism, and humanism in the name of protecting Iowa's morals and values from the decadent path taken by communist or socialist countries, right? Sweden, Russia. And this comes up a lot. And I should say those are my sources, and I'll talk a little bit more about pouring through hundreds of these letters that people wrote to their legislators. Also, you should be thinking about those letters, because sometimes historian, maybe in 50 years, is going to read what you said to your local legislator. Connecting seemingly disjointed concerns for demographic change, nationalism, motherhood, anti-communism, and preservation of fetal life against liberalizing abortion in Iowa were part of a still nascent anti-abortion movement that would come to flourish in the decades after Roe v. Wade. And this is work. There's really two great historians who are doing work on this, Jennifer Holland and Carissa Hageberg, who have been writing extensively about the anti-abortion movement in the years after Roe. I highly recommend you look up their books. They're fantastic. By unspooling this historical thread that unites major changes in reproductive rights laws, we begin to understand how attitudes about the politics of demographic and population changes swelled white Anglo-Saxons' anxieties around American morality and culture. Demographic changes have since at least the 19th century, as I was just talking with Horatio Storer, produced anxieties about the racial composition of the United States that pull at cultural ideas undergirding white nationalism. Values uplifting frugality, hard work, independence. I'm sorry, and I've lost my reason, respect, liberty, virility, and its control have been critical ideological components of white Anglo-Saxon Christian racial formation in the United States. As coastal and borderland states quickly began to see massive and seemingly unbridled demographic changes in the 20th century US, the US's imagined heartland, this area here, became the last great space to preserve values and ideals whites felt were under attack. These anxieties became even more pronounced as the end of the civil rights era bled into the era of militant activism against the war in Vietnam and for freedom struggles among Black, Latina, Latino, and indigenous communities, as well as the growing women's movement. In other words, in an overwhelmingly white state such as Iowa, census data reveals it was 99% white in 1960 and 98% white in 1970, abortion debates were driven by different arguments in support of white supremacy. And these are some of the legislators whose letters I wrote. And as I said, I use Iowa as a focal point for this analysis for several reasons. First, its location, bordering several Midwestern states, right? We know what they are: Nebraska, South Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Missouri. Places Iowa at the literal center of this so-called heartland, an imagined white, bucolic, pristine, hardy, bountiful Christian oasis at the very core of the American nation. Its picturesque farmscapes live effortlessly in the minds of most white Americans envisioning their homeland. Second, as I said, historian Jay Moore's article demonstrates Iowans' deliberations over liberalizing abortion restrictions were perfectly preserved in the records of several state legislators, including Earl M. Willits, Charlene Conklin, and Minette Doderer. Reading the hundreds, and I'm still working on them, but I've gotten through about 200 maybe, and I have a wonderful student here, Erica Zerke, who's also helping me do that incredible work at the library, at the Iowa Women's Archive. I highly recommend folks go there. It's incredible. So we've been poring over these letters, reading the hundreds of letters written by mostly white, mostly rural, mostly Christian and Catholic constituency in Iowa, offering their justifications for either allowing abortion restrictions to remain or overturning them completely, becomes a window into the heart and soul of white Americans wrestling with differing definitions and visions of white supremacy. And I want to be clear. When I use the word white supremacy, I don't mean KKK, right? And we need to kind of detangle that. I literally mean what that means. It means a notion of whiteness that wants to reign supreme in culture, in law, in society, right? That's what I mean by white supremacy. They were wrestling over that. Should white supremacy concern itself with clamping down on a global, mostly Black and brown population run amok? One that might eventually make its way to the heartland? Should Iowans discipline and control their own fertility as an example to others incapable of doing so? Or should white supremacy focus on protecting the moral fiber of America, life, liberty, property, and virility? These are not necessarily oppositional concerns. Rather, in the debate about abortion, they help to shape opposing viewpoints. Finally, Iowa's demographic reality could not have created a starker contrast to its residents' fears. Both its racial composition and population density did not, and still do not, warrant the level of racial anxiety and animus created by the population explosion scares and abortion disputes of the 1960s. And yet, in the spring of 1969, Iowa City's Press Citizen dedicated nearly all of its editorial page to the question of overpopulation with a headline blaring, quote, "How fast is the world growing? 72 million people yearly." Several articles accompanied the central overpopulation focus, including an analysis about the war in Vietnam and another titled, quote, "The New Face of Black Power." The juxtaposition of these issues elevated and added gravitas to the overpopulation debate happening on that same page. The massive image that complemented these news stories provided visual guidance to the reader on both sides of the abortion debate. Alarming to those who worried about overpopulation were certainly the numerical figures and the regional diagrams depicted in the image. The map revealed that nearby Central America held the fastest growing population in the world, with Costa Rica leading the pack. In the following years, this would be Mexico, and I write about the history of overpopulation scares in Mexico in the late 1970s. It would replace the epicenter. So here it is with Costa Rica, and then less than a decade later, it becomes Mexico. Immigration fears and concerns of, quote, hordes of Latin Americans spilling across the U.S. border had been a constant concern for white Americans since the early 20th century. Overall, the largest contributors to the overpopulation problem, those having the most babies, were Africa, Asia, and Latin America, continents considered to house all the world's developing nations. The Press Citizen's editors cited University of Iowa, and you know, here's what it gets weird. A lot of these folks are still alive. So I love when we get to study people who are no longer alive, but it gets dangerous when you start to, people are like, wait a minute, that's my grandpa. I just saw him. So shout out to Hugh Dingle, if any of his family is here. Hugh Dingle, his main issue was that, quote, millions die now in the world of causes related to starvation. And, quote, what is occurring now is that temporary expedients to ease the problem of starvation are only producing more people to starve later. Dingle estimated that easing poverty via food programs to those in the so-called third world was backfiring on the first world. Rather than aid emerging nations during the post-colonial period, and this is after Europe and the United States had bankrolled most of their industrialization in the first world through the exploitation and expropriation of land and labor in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, the developed world was in danger of being overcome by explosive third world populations. The editors concluded that the doubling of the world's population would undoubtedly double, quote, human suffering around the globe. Many Iowan residents agreed. Supporters of liberalizing abortion restrictions sent countless letters to legislators connecting greater abortion access to ending overpopulation. Several Cedar Falls residents wrote in a telegram, quote, no one can argue that we don't have enough unwanted babies. Let us do now what we humanely can to reduce the present oversupply. We urge you to vote yes on the abortion bill, and thus do your part to reduce the misery and unhappiness in today's world. Another Cedar Falls couple expressed a similar sentiment, writing, quote, we believe that our society must realistically acknowledge and act on population control measures in order to maintain a free and healthy society. We urge you to support prompt passage of the bill to liberalize the Iowa abortion laws. We should provide an opportunity for children not to be born into unwanted environments, they said. By the following year, some legislators expressed agreement with their constituents as they leaned into the varied arguments in favor of greater abortion access. Earl M. Willett, Democrat from Polk County in the Iowa House, replied to a voter's inquiry about the proposed abortion liberalization legislation, saying this: This seems to me the wise step to take at this time in light of the problems we face with unwanted children, women seeking illegal abortion, and overpopulation, he said. Claims that there existed an oversupply of babies hearken to the discourses about the supposed hyperfertility among women of color the world over and the deep need for expanding family planning campaigns, including access to abortion and sterilization. And this is around the same time when we see these old sort of eugenic laws that had been on the books as early as 1919. We see a ratcheting up of racist sterilization campaigns in places like California. In 1973, actually the same year that Roe v. Wade is passed, there's a huge lawsuit against the county hospital in Los Angeles for forcibly sterilizing without their consent hundreds of Mexican origin women, right? So this is why this is a critically important history, because we need to understand that the racial justifications for reproductive freedom do have consequences, right? That overpopulation would somehow, quote, curtail, claims that there existed an oversupply of babies hearken to the discourses about supposed hyperfertility among women of color the world over, that overpopulation would somehow curtail Iowa's access to a, quote, free and healthy society, also recalled early 20th century birth control activists and advocates' rhetoric about the need to curb excessive fertility among the so-called eugenically unfit, lest their kind continue to pollute the national gene pool and expand the welfare state. And here's Paul Ehrlich. National organizations for population control played a major role in framing the abortion debate in Iowa. Zero population growth gained traction with Iowa residents, and local chapters appeared in Johnson, Polk, and Black Hawk counties. As local papers explained, ZPG was a, quote, brainchild of Paul Ehrlich, the Stanford biologist who had won acclaim and captured the world with his dire warnings of an impending civilizational collapse due to unmitigated reproduction. The leader of the Iowa City Johnson County chapter stated that they had received hundreds of inquiries from residents interested in joining their 25-member group. In Cedar Falls, the local coordinator of the ZPG chapter, Dr. Darrell Hoff, professor of earth sciences, declared that, quote, the threat of overpopulation has not gone away during this first year of our group's existence. And I will say for now that the majority of these folks who joined the ZPG were men. The ZPG provided important framing for the movement for zero population growth in Iowa, offering key policy points such as, quote, supporting birth control programs for all citizens, increased contraceptive research, new abortion laws, wider roles for women, and tax laws to encourage, rather than discourage, smaller families. As historian Matthew Connolly notes, the Zero Population Growth National Organization believed that, quote, population control begins at home. And among its adherents were those who believed the U.S. should install a penal code that, quote, called for the sterilization of parents with 5 or more children. Some in the family planning movement, like Dr. Alan Guttmacher, the once president of Planned Parenthood Federation of America, suggested that organizations such as ZPG were, quote, a smokescreen for something else, including white supremacy and anti-communism. On the other hand, those who opposed liberalizing abortion restrictions sometimes conceded that the population issue was important, but believed that the greater evil was a loss of American morality, the potential for the proliferation of communist ideas, including an expansion of the welfare state. This was critical. Lots of people did not want access to the welfare state increase for anyone, and the overall decay of a once boundless American society. One Waterloo resident letter writer remarked that after the communists took over Russia in 1917, the Soviets had moved to legalize abortion. However, quote, the Reds saw the debilitating effect abortion was having in the country and then banned the procedure in 1936. The irony of the statement was that less than 2 decades before this, organizations such as Planned Parenthood used Russia as the perfect example of out-of-control fertility, one that was specific to communist societies. Another Cresco, Iowa resident explained that liberalizing Iowa's abortion laws would, quote, bring the wrath of God upon us, who are decent citizens of the state. He continued that, quote, the evil of abortion seems to go with the welfare state. It would, in the end, have a debilitating effect on our country. Undergirding these comments was a sense that liberalizing abortion laws would debilitate an otherwise virile nation, one meant to spread its national seed from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Providing safe access to abortion would bring about God's condemnation on a peaceful people and would push the nation into chaos. An Iowa resident's missive determined that, quote, "In my opinion, passing laws to make life easier for those who are now breaking them is just another step we're taking in the direction of breaking down the moral fiber of our country." It's critical to remember that these letters were not written in a historical vacuum, but came amid massive social unrest, namely violent uprisings, many taking place in America's heartland. Indeed, the country was reeling from the assassinations of Dr. Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy the year before, as well as growing, visible rage against the Vietnam War. I'm almost done. As Iowa state legislators debated the pros and cons of liberalizing abortion restrictions in Iowa throughout the first 2 years of the 1970s, activists and attorneys were pushing for national constitutional change. A lawsuit emerging from Texas made it all the way to the Supreme Court, and on January 22nd, 1973, SCOTUS decided Roe v. Wade in a 7-2 ruling guaranteeing women the constitutional right to abortion. Roe settled the abortion debate in Iowa. I would like to argue, though, that although Iowans did not decide the abortion question in the state, these abortion debates unleashed nefarious ideas about the importance of fertility control that were deeply rooted to anxieties about changing demographics and perceptions of a threatened white American society. Even as supporters of liberalizing abortion laws grounded their arguments in population control discourses, and those against abortion claimed religious righteousness, anti-communist sentiments, and virile nationalism, each group sought to do so within larger tensions about the meaning of white supremacy and white American dominance in the late 1960s and 1970s. These tensions have never gone away. They have metastasized and transformed. I believe they have reemerged today with a vengeance. Abortion is only the tip of the iceberg, not only when it comes to accessing reproductive health care, but also as a canary in the coal mine of racial politics and fears of a white population in decline. This Washington Post editorial from Sunday, just this past Sunday, explains that, quote, "The group that has declined the most is at the core of the, quote, MAGA movement, the group most devoted to Christian nationalism. Quote, white evangelical Protestants have experienced the steepest decline. As recently as 2006, white evangelical Protestants comprised nearly 1/4 of Americans, 23%. By the time of Trump's rise to power, their numbers had dipped to 16.8%. Today, white evangelical Protestants comprise only 13.6% of the total American population. As this group becomes a rising minority, they have launched full-fledged attacks against vulnerable populations, including an assault against the resources and services this growing majority needs. This includes access to abortion, gender-affirming care, public education, and other social services once offered without much complaint to the residents of Iowa. Iowa's changing population and a fervent white Christian nationalist agenda may explain why recent extreme legislative changes have occurred. And quote, all of this I'm quoting from the legislature here in Iowa. Quote, Iowa historically has been one of the most homogeneous states with respect to race leading the way. With respect to race and ethnicity, the state is becoming notably more diverse. In this regard, children are leading the way. Children of a race other than white and or who are Hispanic represent 21.1% of Iowa's children from 0 to 5 years old and 17.2% of the 6 to 17-year-old population, but only 2.9% of the 65-plus population. Over the last 2 decades, the Hispanic young child population in Iowa has more than doubled. And in fact, people of Hispanic descent are now the largest minority in the state. All other minority groups, including people who identify 2 or more races, have grown significantly as well. Iowa's population is projected to continue becoming more diverse over the next decade, although at a slower rate than during the 2000s. The growth of minority communities is a key component of overall population growth in the state. Without growth among children of color and or of Hispanic descent, Iowa's young child population would have declined. If there were no Latinos in the state, Iowa's child population would have declined statewide and in 70 of the 99 counties. This is from a legislature's report in 2010, right? This is why when Lauren Boebert recently, do you guys all know who Lauren Boebert is? Just a Republican from Colorado, said, I'm so happy that rural Coloradan people are having more babies, right? This is what she's talking about. She's talking about this demographic change. In this way, the problem of demographic change and white supremacy that is at the root of anti-abortion legislation has managed to ensnarl many other social issues in our state. If we are to move forward with justice and freedom in our hearts for all residents of Iowa, we must be clear on how these issues connect and intersect at the county and state level. Importantly, most importantly, we have to look to history to be our guide as we face this irrevocable change together. Thank you.
We are at a little past 8 o'clock.
Sorry.
Thank you for staying with these really rich presentations, but I think we could take questions for about 10 minutes, if you will. Yeah.
So
the library knows.
if you have a question, I will bring you the microphone so that the folks who are watching us can also hear the question. So, questions? Thoughts? Wow. Just wow.
Or you can also just still be processing. It's okay.
Yeah.
As you were talking about the history, that it reminded me now of the heartbeat bills being promoted, which seem to go along in a long line of fictions. I don't know if that means anything, or if you can comment about the heartbeat bill movement.
Well, it's all in the service of identifying when life begins and when, some demarcation line that would replace quickening. In the 19th century, you couldn't hear the heartbeat until after quickening. And so that wasn't an issue then.
I would say that one of the two historians that I mentioned, so Carissa Hageberg and Jennifer Holland. Jennifer Holland's book is called Tiny You, and Carissa Hageberg, who actually was a student here at the University of Iowa. She was Linda Kerber's student and wrote a book called Women Against Abortion. They sort of center that movement, the heartbeat, and the sort of fetal personhood movement really taking off in the years right after Roe. Although in some of the letters that I'm looking at here at Iowa, there are people talking about abortion is murder. They are using that language in 1968, 1969. But this is all about the way that technology can help justify that kind of language, right? And so, and like I said, that's not necessarily the period that I talk about too much, but those historians have done a really wonderful job of talking about the sort of cultural shifts that the anti-abortion movement did, so that and it is very much a movement that's steeped in white supremacy and white nationalism. The way that they were able to transpose their humanhood onto the fetus, and that it becomes now in the 21st century that they can use technology as a means to justify this ideology, right? So that's where, the sort of fetal heartbeat that, physicians have debunked this and said, like, those are cells, it's not a heartbeat, it's a sound that the machine makes so that you can hear that there's an existence of blood flowing. But we've identified, like, people have identified it as, oh, this is the heartbeat. And so that's right, like, the way that technology and culture have worked together to help bolster that kind of legislation.
This isn't really a question, but I'm just stunned that it's never been about women's rights.
Right. Actually, I have one man in the 1850s who says, and I wish I'd written the quote down here, this is a woman's choice. She has autonomy over her body. There are a few people you can find who say this.
Yeah.
She has the right to decide at the beginning or at the end of pregnancy. It would be nice if she would consult her family and her husband and her religion and her morals and all that, but ultimately it's her choice over her body. And I'm actually writing a book about this guy now, and that's how I got into this whole abortion story to begin with, because I wanted to learn whether his comment was shared widely in his culture, and it wasn't shared widely, at least not in print. But he was part of a reform movement to reform marriages as well, and he was married to a remarkable woman who believed a lot in women's autonomy over her own body too. So there are a few, but not many. It's really surprising.
And I would say that I also, so I'm like partway through these letters. I'm not, no way done, but I did find one that stuck out to me that was also very similar. It was a physician, a man, and he uses religious discourse, and he says something to the effect of like, God gave women the power to decide on their lives and on their pregnancies. And this is something that we should respect. This is the sort of ultimate sort of natural law that God has bestowed on women, which I thought was very powerful. But that's like one quote among hundreds of others, right? So it's like finding the needle in the haystack of people who have these very kind of feminist or woman-centered visions of reproduction.
But with the fact that we find them proves that somebody could think it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Somebody could think it, but it's not common.
Right, absolutely.
I mean, remember the mid-19th century is a time when there's a women's rights movement that has an uphill battle convincing anyone that women have any rights, you know? So the right to abortion is not going to be the first right that women are granted in the 1850s.
Thank you guys so much for defining what quickening was, because I'd heard that a woman could have an abortion before quickening, but I had no idea when that was. And 22 weeks is halfway through your 40-week pregnancy. So if you put that into terms of trimester, that's first and second trimester that people were having abortions. So that's really helpful information to know.
Also, in relation to quickening, I guess I'm wondering, is that same like time frame between when like a woman could get pregnant and when she knows she's pregnant, quickening back then, does that also tie to the different kind of time frames that we've seen in the modern kind of bans on abortions, with the whole like 6-week ban, 15-week ban, and that too? Like I assume these days it is tied more medically, but I guess like you could still see those trends back then as well, I suppose.
Yeah, I think one difference is that we didn't have in the 19th century all the technology we have now to prove that there's a pregnancy in process. And so they had to have something to point to, and the quickening seemed to be it. Nothing else offered itself. And with the advance of technology,
I would say that some of those time frames are like actually kind of arbitrary, right? So like if you listen to the Dobbs case, like when they were during the hearings, they're like throwing out these time, the justices are, Justice Roberts is like, well, what's the difference between like 15 and like, let's say 12? And it's like, you're negotiating, like here you guys are negotiating what would be more, acceptable to, a bunch of, as far as I know, people who are no longer reproducing. It is very arbitrary, and part of it does certainly have to do with technology, right? And so this is where you've got these very complicated and at times difficult conversations where technology keeps pushing forward. In my class on global reproduction, I show the creation of a womb where people have been birthing lambs, right, like sheep. And so these artificial wombs that at some point in the future will be used instead of us or whatever. And so it's like there's a lot of technology that is very much informing the way that we have these conversations. That's why I think it's critical to understand this history, this really long, rich history, so that we can talk about what it means to live in a democracy with as a fully autonomous human being, right, with rights over our bodies. Because when we lose that, then we no longer can exist in a democracy as full citizens. And so I feel like that's the conversation. I think these other things get in the way to try to divert us from that critical idea.
I'm going to say that's a perfect place to stop.
Okay. Sorry.
If you have other questions, feel free to come up and ask, but we'll call it. Thank you very much for coming.